And we're off and running. Okay, so good, well, afternoon technically by the sun, but we'll call it evening as well. Either words are fine. It's good to be back together again after our break because of the holiday and everything else that was going on. So because, of course, the holiday happened, it means we are now getting ready for the next holiday. Now, you may remember way back at the beginning, I did a real big arc of all the holidays. And now we are drilling down into each of them as we come by. And tonight we're going to start with Shavuot. And hopefully we're also going to get to some bonus material on a somewhat related topic, but it wasn't a topic that could do a whole class on. So I'm going to try and slide it in. We'll see how well I can make the transition. So, Shavuot. Before we get to Shavuot, we've got another job to do, another mitzvah. It's called the counting of the Omer, Sfirat HaOmer. As you can see from the book of Leviticus, we are commanded that we should count on the morrow after the day of rest, from the day that you brought the Omer of the offering, that was the grain offering that came at the time of Passover, 7 complete weeks. And the day after the 7th week will number 50 days, and you will offer a new grain offering to the Lord. Well, that 50-day mark, that's the holiday of Shavuot, and that means 7 weeks. We have 49 days in between Passover and Shavuot, and we call that the counting of the Omer. And you may have noticed a rather unusual word here. It says after the day of rest, of Shabbat. And indeed, among the Sadducees, they believe that meant that you went from the first Shabbat after Passover and started counting. But the rabbis, the Hachamim, said no. You start the day after the first day of Shabbat. So the second night of Pesach is when you start the counting. Well, you're probably wondering, how can we call it the day after Passover if what we're talking about is Shabbat, if the Hebrew word is Shabbat? Well, that's why I brought the bottom quote or summary. Shabbat sometimes means day number 7 of the week, right? That's what it usually means in our regular conversation. If I say see you on Shabbat, you know I'm talking about what we say in English is Saturday, or maybe Friday night at the very least. But sometimes the same word also means the day of rest, a Shabbaton. It's a day of rest. For example, in Leviticus 23, not far off from where we are talking about the counting of the Omer, both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are called Shabbat. Now, that can't mean that they happen on day number 7, because between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there are 10 days. So if one of them is on Shabbat, the other one has to not be on Shabbat. It's impossible for them to both be on Shabbat, and yet they are both called Shabbat. Therefore, we know that the word Shabbat means generally a day of rest, and indeed the holidays, the Chagim, are often called Shabbaton. They're called days of rest. So the counting begins on the day after that first day of Passover, and then goes for the 49 days until we get to the holiday of Shavuot. Make sense? Good. Don't worry, you don't have to do the math, because there are wonderful guidelines. Oh, someone else here? Wonderful guidelines. There are even apps for helping to keep you on track for the counting of the Omer. You can get little apps for your phone or your computer or emails. They'll send you reminders, and they'll give you the blessing and everything that you need to do.
This year is relatively easy because April 1st was also the first day of the counting of the Omer. Each day of April is correct. Today's April 12th, and it was the 12th day of the Omer. I'm having a much easier time keeping track of this year.
You know, I actually hadn't noticed that.
Yes, it is, but it is.
It's that's good to keep track of. Yeah. But yeah, you'll often see people will have calendars they can mark off as they count, so they can keep track of. Some of the forms of synagogue art during the Middle Ages and Renaissance were Omer counters, so that the synagogue, the sanctuary, would have a little plaque, and it would be like silver or something, and people would change the numbers to make sure they always had the right count as they went through the 7 weeks of the Omer.
And in modern days on my phone, I have Homer's Omer.
Yep, there's the counting of the Domer from Homer Simpson.
Homer Simpson,
yep.
right on there.
Yep. Now, this is one of the easiest and the hardest mitzvahs to do. So it's actually really great practice for taking on mitzvot. It's easy because the blessing is literally one sentence, right? That says, you commanded us to count the Omer. Boom. And then you have to say what day it is and what the week is. Now, by week, what I mean is, if you say today is day, for example, today day, not tonight, today is day 12, then I would say today is the 12th day of the Omer. That is 1 week and 5 days. So we mention both versions, either the total number, or the total number and the total week plus day number, because the commandment was a little unclear. Are we counting the days or are we counting the weeks? And so we count both, and that way we're covered. It's just to be sure. However, it's a tricky mitzvah to do, not because it's so hard or because it takes so much time or it's expensive or anything. It's not like cleaning for Passover, but because it seems, by the way the commandment is written and the way most authorities agree, that in order to really do the full mitzvah, you can't miss. You can't skip a day. So for 49 days, you have to make sure you do the same thing to get one mitzvah complete. There's a little bit of a compromise in that debate, because it's a debate, which is, if you miss a day, you can keep counting, but you no longer say the Baruch Atah, you no longer say the blessing, because now we're doubtful. And when in doubt, we don't say the blessing, because that way we don't use God's name in vain. So it's an easy mitzvah to do, and it's a hard mitzvah to complete, because you have to really be paying attention and stay on task. But it's great, because after 49 days, you have the sense of, I've really stuck with it. I've made my way all the way through it, and it's good practice for doing other things like tefillah every day, a little study every day, and other types of things that should become part of our daily life. The counting of the Omer is a great way to build that in. It's also a good way, if you're not yet used to the idea of having moments of reflection, to take a little time each day and to think about where we are headed. We're going to talk about that in more detail, but it's a good, just peaceful moment to take for yourself. Okay, questions on that so far? Good. During the counting of the Omer, we have an unusual overlap with another historical event. It says in the Talmud that the Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples, 12,000 pairs of students, so 24,000 people that were his students. And they were living from Gabat to Antipatris, which is the whole area around where he lived, and all of them died in a single season. Why? Because they did not treat one another with respect. And it was taught that all of them died between Passover and Shavuot. That's kind of an unusual story. Now, this story has layers to it. So indeed, in the Talmud, it talks about this as being because they didn't respect one another. But in other teachings, for example, from Rav Shariat Gaon, one of the great Gaonim of the Middle Ages, well, Dark Ages, as people often call it, he said that Rabbi Akiva raised many students, but there was a religious persecution, a shmada, that came on the students of Rabbi Akiva. Why would there have been a special persecution on his students? Well, because we know from the Rishalmi and other texts, Rabbi Akiva was one of those that supported the Bar Kokhba revolt. If you remember back from our history class, Bar Kokhba was back in 136, was one of the people who made the best fight against Rome to try and throw off the Romans. And Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai taught, Akiva, my master, would expound the verse, a star will come from Jacob, as Koziba, which he could read as Kochva, right, a Kochav, a star, a morning star, will come from Jacob. When Rabbi Akiva would see Bar Koziba, which was the name of Bar Kokhba, he would say, there is the King Messiah. So Rabbi Akiva really believed that Bar Kokhba would be Mashiach, would be the one who would deliver us from the Romans, who would bring the new era of peace, and he supported Bar Kokhba. And you can imagine that when Bar Kokhba lost, the people who supported him were now enemies of the Romans. And indeed, Rabbi Akiva himself was captured by the Romans, and he was tortured and killed in public display. They tore his skin from him with iron hooks. Yeah, the Romans were always very creative in how they murdered people, very inventive. But even when Rabbi Akiva said that, Rabbi Yochanan ben Tortor would say, Akiva, grass will grow from your cheeks and still the son of David will not come. Which basically means you and me, we're going to be long dead before Mashiach comes. Right? Grass growing from your cheeks means you're buried in the ground and you're pushing up daisies, we say in American English, 6 feet under. He was trying to be realistic and he's saying, Bar Kokhba may be good, but he's not Mashiach. This is not the redemption we're waiting for. And indeed, unfortunately, Rav Yochanan ben Tortor was right that this led. So because of that, we have a period of, during the counting of the Omer, of sadness as we remember this part of our catastrophe. So that is doubled down because during the late Middle Ages, this time period after Passover became a very dangerous time for Jewish people in Christian Europe. Because in Christian Europe, there became this idea of what we call the blood libel. Many people in Europe began to say that Jews would steal Christian babies and that we would use their blood to make our matzah. Right? It's one of the worst lies that they've ever told about us. Since, I mean, as you know, blood is something we definitely don't eat, and human blood even more so. But that meant that if any children went missing around the time of Passover, guess who got blamed? And so we were always very nervous during this time. So this period after Passover through Shavuot became a very tense time. And so the mood was always one of very, we're just not going to be too happy right now. And so during this time, we don't get haircuts, we don't shave beards, we don't do unnecessary celebrations, right? So if somebody is having a baby and there's a Brit Milah, of course, we can't put off having the baby. wait for another 7 weeks. It doesn't work like that. But if you were just wanted to throw a party because you wanted to have fun, not usually during this time of the year. And other social entertainments and concerts and stuff like that are also usually turned down or off during this time. Now that period finishes on Lag BaOmer. Lag is the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. And once Lag BaOmer comes, then we can go back to our happier times, because it says that the attacks on Rabbi Akiva's students finished on Lag BaOmer. That was the end of the worst of it. All right, questions? Okay. So let's get to the holiday that comes at the end, Shavuot. The Omer is done. We reach Shavuot. Shavuot actually has 3 names in the Torah. It is called Chag HaKatzir, which means the harvest festival for harvesting your grains, as it says in Exodus, and the feast of the harvest of the first fruits of your work, of what you sow in the field. It's also called Chag HaBikurim in the book of Numbers. Also on the day of the first fruits, when you bring new meal offering to the Lord in your feast of weeks, you shall have a holy gathering. You shall do no servile work, no work on that day. And of course, it's also called Chag Shavuot, which means the Feast of Weeks, because it's the weeks that add up to this time. So that's one way to remember it. And Deuteronomy, then you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, Chag Shavuot, for the Lord your God, offering your free will contribution according as the Lord your God has blessed you. Make sense? So 3 different names, still just one holiday. But we need to figure out what each one of these is talking about, because each feeling is different. So we're going to talk about the Bikurim first, the first fruits. The first fruits was a very special part of Jewish life. It says that we need to bring the first fruits to the temple, and that starts, the bringing of the first fruits starts on Shavuot. That's the beginning. And those first fruits were from the 7 special species of land of Israel. So from wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. You were harvesting those things, the first of those things you would bring to Jerusalem as a celebration. And there's a little bit of an example from Bikurim in the Mishnah that talks about how this would work. So at the rise of the morning, an official would say, "Rise and let us go up to Zion," one of the other words for Jerusalem, "to the house of the Lord our God, to the temple." And an ox would walk before them, its horns covered with gold and with an olive crown on its head. So they would decorate the cow. And the Halil, the flute, was played for them until they reached the vicinity of Jerusalem, until they get near to Jerusalem. So you have to imagine your village. It's like, all right, guys, time to go for the First Fruits Festival. And you guys would all gather your first fruits and we'd all walk to Jerusalem and we'd be playing music and we'd be walking behind this pretty cow. It was a real occasion that people would be celebrating.
I had been in Israel one year during Passover, and January, February, March, things aren't growing.
Yeah, that's
waiting
right.
for the harvest to come in. So it really is a celebration when you finally see the first date growing, the first bit of wheat. You do want to thank God because you just come through a wintertime when nothing's been growing. So it's a really beautiful celebration.
Exactly right. I mean, if you've never really been a farmer, you don't know how good it feels to see the food growing and knowing you're not going to starve to death. Most of us hopefully have never experienced that sort of food fear of whether we are confident we're going to have enough food. If you ever have, then you'd have a bit of a taste of why these people would rejoice the way they did. So upon coming close to Jerusalem, they sent word ahead and decorated the Bikurim. They would decorate the fruit themselves. And then with the basket on the shoulder, they would come up to the temple of Jerusalem, and then they'd make a declaration. "I have told the Lord your God this day that I have come to this land and swore to your fathers to give us. My father was a wandering Aramean." If that sounds familiar, that was in your Haggadah. Oh, someone else at the door? Ah, okay. So if that sounds familiar, this paragraph is what we read in the Haggadah as part of the telling of the Exodus, because it is a great synopsis of our journey as a people. And of course, the end of that journey is, and God brought us to this place, and God gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and now I bring the first fruits of the land that you have given me, O God. So every time you would come up to bring these first fruits, you would remind yourself of the whole history of our people and how lucky we are to now live in a place where we can have this food, these fruits, be free and be able to celebrate. And after completing the entire portion, he places the basket by the side of the altar, he bows and goes out, and the next person comes along and does as well. So this was a huge, huge festival for the temple days. Good? Okay. But this is also Chag HaKatzir, the festival of harvest. And why is it called that? Well, as Harriet was mentioning, at Pesach, the barley harvest comes, and that ends the wintertime famine, right? And then we count the Omer, and those spring harvests of the barley are giving us hope, right? We're okay. We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. On Shavuot, however, that's when the wheat harvest really begins. And wheat is better than barley. Not just because it tastes better, but it does. But wheat is also what you really need to survive and succeed, because you get more calories from wheat per acre than you do from barley. So this was a very important crop for knowing that you're not going to starve to death. And then, of course, if you want to finish the cycle, we get the long days of hard work throughout summer. And then by Sukkot, which is the final of the 3 holidays, we have full barns, full silos, all sorts of food, all sorts of fruit. We are just so happy and ready for a break. And then you start the work all over again in the winter planting, and then the whole cycle continues year after year after year. Make sense? So that's why it's also called Chag HaKatzir. Even though Passover begins the harvest, the real harvesting begins at Shavuot. This is when we're serious about it, not just the little stuff that's coming in. But Shavuot also has another name, Zman Matan Torah, the time of the giving of the Torah. Now, this name is not in the Torah. The Torah doesn't tell us that Shavuot was the time of the giving of the Torah. However, if you do a little math, you find out that it is. So we find out in Exodus 19, which is when we're about to receive the 10 Commandments, that on the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. So that means on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, we are coming up to the foot of Mount Sinai. And then we get the speech that we will be a kingdom of priests. And then we get the idea that we need to set boundaries. And Moses tells us that there needs to be a period of separation. And then we get the Torah on that day. And you can find out more of this discussion in the Talmud on Shabbat 86b. So that means on the 6th of Sivan, we are receiving the Torah. The 6th of Sivan is Shavuot. Right? It links up perfectly. So when we celebrate Shavuot, we also celebrate that God gave us the Torah on that day. Now you might be wondering, don't we already have a Torah holiday? The whole Simcha Torah thing? Yes, we do. But Simcha Torah celebrates the cycle of reading the Torah. Shavuot celebrates the first giving of the Torah. That makes sense, the difference? Right? So we get two Torah holidays, which, Torah is important. So it makes sense that we celebrate it a little bit more than we might do anything else. And it just so happens that we can take our harvest map and we can put our history map along the top of it and see that the emotions fit together very nicely. That Pesach, end of winter famine, that's our slavery ending, right? The counting of the Omer, which is hopeful growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, that's our marching towards Sinai. Each day as we got further from Egypt and closer to Israel, our spirit was being uplifted, our hope was being better, and slavery, the darkness of winter, the darkness of being in Egypt is falling away from us each and every day. That's one reason, by the way, that we count up on the Omer rather than counting down on the Omer. And then Shavuot, where we begin the joy, that's the giving of the Torah. That's the fulfillment of our freedom, right? God didn't make us free just to make us free. It's fine, would be nice. But even better than that, he gave our freedom meaning by giving us the Torah. And so Shavuot is that. And then as we continue our march, we're moving on towards something that's even better, but still awfully hard, which is moving towards Israel. And Sukkot, of course, is God giving us shelter, God giving us support and protection throughout the way along that long journey, which ended up taking a little longer than expected, but God was still there to support us throughout the entire trip. And just as God supports us throughout this entire cycle. You can imagine, for a good farmer life, you begin way back here in winter with your planting and everything, and you have to hope that you're going to make the promised land, make the end of the harvest and have enough, and know that you're going to make it through another year. And so the whole cycle fits both historical and agricultural feelings. Make sense? Okay. Also on Shavuot, we read from the book of Ruth. This is a custom, but it's a very strong custom. So we don't say a blessing before we do it, but we do make sure that we do it. Now, why did we pick the book of Ruth for things to read? Well, we read from the book of Ruth when they arrive back in the land of Israel. Does everyone know basically the story of Ruth? Right? She was from the land of Moab, and then she moves back to the land of Israel. And when they arrive back in the land of Israel, they're very poor. They have nothing. And Ruth, the Moabitess, says to Naomi, who's her mother-in-law, let me go to the field and let me glean. Let me gather from the ears of corn. That's an old translation. The ears of grain. Right? Corn is the old English word for any type of grain, not only the yellow stuff. After him in whose sight I shall find favor. So let me find somebody who's nice. I'll work in his field. I'll be able to pick up the extra food because we know the Torah says I'm allowed to. And Naomi says to her, go, my daughter. So what time of year is the story of Ruth happening? It's happening during the time of Shavuot, right? When the big harvest has begun. So the story setting matches the holiday of Shavuot very well. But there's a second reason why Ruth is read for Shavuot. Because what is Ruth most famous for is the fact that she is not born Jewish and she doesn't have to be Jewish, but instead she chooses to go with Naomi, chooses to return to the land of Israel, and chooses to become part of the Jewish people. When Naomi tells her to leave, Ruth replies, "Do not urge me to leave you," right? Or to turn back and not follow you. "For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, wherever you like sleep or live, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you." Right? Ruth gives one of the best speeches ever of what it means to try to join oneself to the Jewish people and to God. That's the feeling we have when we remember the giving and our acceptance of Torah. Right? This is the attitude we should have when we remember God offering us the Torah and us grabbing it with both arms and just holding on forever. So Ruth is a symbol of what it means to cleave to God, is one of the words we use, to hold on tight, as tightly as we can. So it fits beautifully. And if you haven't read the story of Ruth lately, give it another run. It's just an amazing, amazing story. Which leads to that whole theme of what does it mean to accept the Torah. And there's a great discussion in the Talmud about between people who were Jewish and people who weren't Jewish of what the conversation is going to sound like when we reach the end of days. And when the end of days arrive, the nation of the world will stand before God to be judged. And they will say to him, "Lord of the world, in point of fact, did you give us the Torah and we refuse to accept it?" Right? So they're basically saying, "Hey, God, how can you be angry at us? You didn't give us the Torah. You didn't even offer it to us. Right? So how can you judge us?" So a little bit of chutzpah. But, says the Talmud, how can they present such an argument? How can they say that? Because it's written, "The Lord came from Sinai and rose from Seir to them. He shined forth from Mount Paran." And further, it also says in Habakkuk, "And God comes from Teman." Now, what in the world did he want in Seir? Right? Why does it say that God was in Seir? What was he looking for in Paran? Says Rabbi Yochanan, this teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, made the rounds. He went all around the world to each and every nation and language, and none accepted it until he came to Israel and they accepted it. The idea here being that God was willing and eager to give Torah to anyone who would be willing to take Torah. But there was only one nation that was willing to accept it. And that's us. And therefore, yeah, they did kind of reject it. Now, does that mean that literally like God was going around with a wagon with a big Torah in it saying, "All right, anybody want a Torah? Torah," like peddling the Torah from nation to nation? No. But it means that God did create the world so that God's truth and God's existence would be available, would be noticed by everybody in the world if they chose to look for it, if they were willing to guide their life towards God rather than towards idols and other things. And there really was, in the ancient world, 3,000 plus years ago, only one group of people who was willing to say, "We're going to follow that," rather than going after all the other things. So, yeah, God did make it available to the rest of the world. And 3,000 years ago, you didn't find any other volunteers. So that is something that is very, very special. But they have an answer for that. So instead, this is what the nations will say in their defense. Did we accept the Torah but fail to fulfill it? Right? So this is the criticism of us. Sure, we said, yes, God, we'll take the Torah. And then we spent the next 500 years breaking it. The whole stories of the times of the judges and all the problems under the different kings. We accepted the Torah, but we didn't really live up to it. And they're going to use that as a criticism of us and as an excuse for themselves. But to this, the answer must be, why didn't you accept it at all? Meaning, yes, it's true. The Israelites accepted the Torah, but they didn't live up 100% to what it was supposed to be. But accepting it was still the right decision, right? If somebody says, if your doctor tells you you need to stop smoking, or else you're going to get really, really sick. And you say, well, I could try to stop smoking, but I'll probably still smoke. So I won't try at all. Is that the answer your doctor wants? Or does your doctor want you to say, I'll try. I may not stop 100%. I may only be able to cut down maybe 50%, but I'll try. And the doctor would say, well, 100% is better, but 50% is better than zero. And so too when it came for this. If the nations of the world had wanted to say, well, you know, we're probably still going to make the same kind of mistakes like Israel's making, but at least we'll keep trying to get closer and closer to God. God would have been more than happy and forgiving, just like he is with us when we make our mistakes, when we stumble and we fall. But to not try at all, to not even be willing to give up the idols and the other crimes of the ancient world, that's kind of a problem. You can't say, well, at least I wasn't a hypocrite. I was just bad. Like, no, I'd rather a good person who made mistakes than a bad person who always made mistakes. It's not any defense. But there is a very interesting story at the end. Instead, this is what they'll say before God. Lord of the world, did you hold a mountain over us like a vault, as you did to Israel? And then did we refuse to accept it? Hold a mountain over Israel? What are we talking about here? Well, as it is written in the Torah, and they stood at the base, tachat ahar, which literally means under the mountain. So what does it mean to be under the mountain? Well, it could mean the mountain's here and we're at the bottom, or it could mean the mountain's here and we're here. And so the Midrash says that the Holy One, blessed be he, held the mountain over Israel. Like God picked up Mount Sinai, held it over our heads, and said, okay, if you accept the Torah, great. And if you don't, this will be your grave. I'll bury you. Okay. It's a really powerful story, but we have to uncover what it really means. It's not saying that God forced us to accept the Torah. What it is saying is that God made it clear to us that if we didn't accept Torah, we as the nation of Israel, we would be dead. Not we as individual people. Sure, we'd go on, we'd live, you know, have babies, whatever, become idolaters and go back to Egypt, whatever we wanted to do. But we as a people, we as a nation, we as somebody with a destiny, we'd be gone. Right? If we give up Torah, we die. Not, you know, hospital dead, but spiritual death and national death. The Torah is what keeps us alive, and that has been true ever since. Right? There have been many, many Jews who give up Torah, and when they do so, they don't fall over dead, but their place within our world and our story is gone because they have moved away. Always come back, but for that moment, they are no longer part of that spiritual life. And that was what God was revealing to us, is that the Torah was our life. You'll know as you, I'm sure, are reading and practicing the blessing for coming up for the Torah for an aliyah, we say that God plants chayei olam nata b'tochenu, that God puts an eternal life within us. God has planted that inside of us. We say that when we're doing a blessing for the Torah, not for anything else, because the Torah is that link to eternity, that link to our true life. And if you go away from it, then you're pulling the plug. And that's it. Okay, questions on that? Okay, then we move on. Other customs. Tikkun Leil Shavuot. On the evening of the first day of Shavuot, which is Saturday night this year, we stay up and we study all night, or at least late into the night. Because there's a midrash that says the Israelites went to bed early on the day before the giving of the Torah so that they would be well rested. Good idea, right? But they overslept. And so God had to come and like, come on, wake up. It's time for the Torah giving. Had to wake us up. So Rabbi Karo, Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch and who was a great scholar and a great Kabbalist, he decided to fix their mistake. If their mistake was to neglect Torah because they overslept, we would study Torah instead of sleeping. And so throughout the night, or like I said, at least late into the night, people will stay up and they will study and they will learn in order to show our devotion to Torah and that we're not going to make the same mistake twice. So the Tikkun Leil Shavuot is a very beautiful night of study and sharing ideas and just a really great way to celebrate the gift of Torah. Okay, there is another custom on Shavuot that we don't have a good explanation for, and that's the custom of eating dairy. On all the other holidays, there is a strong custom to eat meat. Apologies to any vegetarians. It's okay if you want to be a vegetarian, but historically, meat was what made a meal a festival. Right? Meat was the meat of the holiday, because you didn't have meat on Thursdays and Tuesdays and Mondays and other days. You had meat only a few times every year, because meat was super, super rare and expensive. So that meant that holidays were all about the meat, except on Shavuot. On Shavuot, there's a custom to have dairy, to have things that are cooked with milk. And obviously, if we're having milk, we're not having meat, because we don't have meat and milk together. Where this came from, we're not 100% sure. Looking back through the different books, that's not a clear explanation of who invented this custom. But there are some very good explanations that are there. One of them is that we know that God told us that we would only be able to eat meat if it had been properly prepared. But we don't get the details of that until after Mount Sinai. So if we know the meat has to be done special, but we don't know how, then we would have to have waited. And that means that until Shavuot, we would have been waiting for meat because we didn't have the rule set. So in order to remind ourselves that we would even give up meat if God asked us to, we have dairy on Shavuot. One other custom, which I think is very beautiful, connects it to Song of Songs. There's a line in Song of Songs that says that honey and milk are under your tongue, which is a beautiful poem for what it means to kiss somebody you love, or in this case, to kiss God through the sweetness of Torah. That when we study Torah, when we do the Torah, it is as though we are kissing God, and that the sweetness of milk is a metaphor for that. I know for a lot of us, we probably don't think of milk as being sweet, but if you used to live before we had bags of sugar, milk was really, really sweet. And that was something that was always a nice treat. Nowadays, for most of us, if you eat a candy bar, milk doesn't taste sweet anymore. It's all about comparisons. Okay, question? Good. Now we're going to transition. Remember I said way back at the beginning of the counting of the Omer that during this period we don't trim the beard, we don't get haircuts. I thought we might also talk a little bit about why don't we trim beards in general? Why do you see so many Jewish men with beards? Why do you see some people with the curls on the side of their head? What's going on there? Well, as you can see in multiple parts of the Torah, God tells us some very important things about getting haircuts. Right? Do not round off the corners, the peyot, on your head, or destroy the corners of your beard. Peyot usually are thought to be this part that's, I'll have a picture later, but this part on the side of the head. Do not make baldness upon your head. If you go bald naturally, it's okay. But this is about shaving parts of your head. Neither shall they shave off the corners of their beard, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. The prohibition on the cuttings in the flesh, by the way, is one of the lines of why we don't do tattoos, of why Jews don't go out and get tattoos. Why? Also because you are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourself, nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. And the line specifically for the dead, many other ancient cultures, when somebody died, they would pull out their hair, they would slice their arms and bleed to show that they were sad. And Judaism said, no. As you know, we have a very full way of showing our sadness, but you don't hurt yourself to show your sadness. And if you don't do this for grief, then you certainly don't do this just to look pretty. So we don't do these cuttings. But what does it mean to cut? Well, if a man makes a baldness on his head, or rounds the corners of his head, or mats the corner, or mars the corners of his beard, then you are liable for this. You have done it. But you are only liable if he takes it off with a razor. So hopefully everybody knows what a razor looks like, right? It's a sharp metal blade. Nowadays you can get them in the little plastic safety razors. In the old days, it was the big, long, razors. If you shave like that, you're breaking the commandment. If you shave with scissors, you have not. You want to make a quick explanation? Yeah. And so there is shaving and there is cutting. Cutting is allowed, shaving is not. So all those fancy 4-blade shaver thingies and all of that, but most electric beard trimmers, the kind that are like those are basically like scissors and no problem. Where there is some debate, what most people agree, is electric razors. Electric razors are usually doing more like a scissor action, where it takes the whisker and it holds it and squeezes it with another piece of metal. Dangerous shaving, back and forth, really, really fast, but it's like tiny, tiny, tiny little miniature scissors going all across your face. So that sometimes people will argue about which razors and that razor, but there are electric razors that everybody agrees are fine. So if you really, really, really want to shave your face, there are ways to do it. The other way to do it is with, what do you call it? The pillatory cream? The Neat, yeah, exactly. You can use lotions that kill the hair. That's also not a problem. Or if you really don't like having a beard, or for some people, their skin needs to not have a beard because the hair will grow inside, then you can always use electrolysis, which is where they destroy each of the hair follicles. Yeah, there are some people that their hair gets ingrown, and then their whole face gets really, really painful. So there are some people who need to shave in order to, keep healthy. But for the rest of us, this is fine. However, for you ladies here, don't worry. Anyone who is subject to the prohibition of destroying the corners of the beard is covered by the prohibition of rounding, meaning up here. But women, who obviously are not subject to the prohibition of marring the corners of the beard, are not subject to the prohibition of rounding. So if you've ever wondered, why do you see men with the peyote, with the extra hair on the side, but you don't see women? It's because women don't have beards. If you have a beard, you have to be careful up here. If you don't have a beard, you don't need to worry about that. Now, up here, again, it only matters if you are shaving it, if you are cutting it with a knife. Scissors are perfectly fine. So go get a regular haircut or electric trimmer things, you're fine. But if you take out like one of those razors and you're like, taking the hair off your hair with the razor, and then you've broken the mitzvah. So you can have a bald head in Judaism with an electric razor, but you can't with a straight razor. Make sense? Okay. Now, the fact that for most of our history, you couldn't get a real smooth face because we didn't have electric razors and little trimmers and all of that, means that for most of our history, Jewish men have had beards. It's simply been what we've had. It may have been a short beard or long beard, but we've had beards because there was no way to really get it down to the skin without breaking the commandment. So that's why you'll still see today, even though we can be smooth-faced, you'll still see many Jewish men with beards because it's become natural for us to have beards, even if we have the option not to. And looking around the room, it's like, wow, everybody's got a beard in here. I mean, all the men have beards. Okay. So the Ritva, one of the great halakhicists, points out a little bit more. according to the letter of law, if one shaves with scissors, even in a way similar to a razor, this is permissible. However, it is customary among pious individuals not to do so due to suspicion by onlookers. And this is indeed the proper way to behave. During the Middle Ages, when you could get really quite close, as they got better and better scissors and metal, people began to not do it because people might think that they were using a razor. Nowadays that we know that there are lots of ways to shave without using a real metal razor, this is not such a big concern. And just one modern on the topic, they say, what is preferable? A Torah teacher with a beard or a Torah teacher without a beard who can explain better, right? A better teacher. And the answer is given, the one who explains better, since learning Torah is a greater mitzvah than having a beard, right? Having a beard the proper way, yes, that's important, it's nice. Not having a beard through the proper way, that's fine too. Learning Torah, that's the most important thing. So if you've been trying to figure out what to do with your facial hair, hopefully you've got a little bit more information now. And I said I'd give you a illustration. So for peyot, the corners on the side, if you take where the hair used to be on the top, and you sort of draw a line back over the ear, the hair underneath that, that's what we mean by peyot. Those are the corners of the head that we don't scrape with a razor. So you can see sort of where the hair turns, where it makes that corner, that's your line. So it's different for each person. And so for this, you wouldn't take and shave that with a razor. But if you want to trim it with scissors, go ahead, no problem. And everybody agrees that the mustache, you can trim anytime you need. That you don't need to have your mustache hanging in your food and all of that. If you want to have it, it's your choice. But everybody agrees you could even cut this with a knife. If you wanted to cut it with a razor, you could cut your mustache with a razor. But personally, I think scissors are a lot safer. Yeah. Good? Okay, that's it for tonight.